Good evening and welcome to Talk of the Neighborhoods. I'm Joe Heisler, your host, coming to you from the BNN Live studios, Eggleston Square, Jamaica Plain, where tonight on the Boston Neighborhood Network, well, we'll talk about last week's big news, the conviction of former probation chief John O'Brien and two of his aides on corruption charges in U.S. District Court, and the implications of that, the fallout, what happens next on Beacon Hill. Tonight, joining me in the first half from Common Cause, the good government, public advocacy, political reform group, Pam Wilmot, its executive director, joins us, and we'll talk about what is next on Beacon Hill. Is this a isolated incident, or is it an indication of a deeper problem there? Then in the second half, helping to have joining us one or more lawmakers, including Representative Aaron Michaelwitz from the North End, to talk about the impact the decision, the conviction had on Beacon Hill. All that and more tonight on Talk of the Neighborhoods. I'm Joe Heisler, your host. Tonight, all politics as is our usual want, and after last week's earth-shaking bomb blast in the U.S. District Court, we're talking about the conviction of former probation department chief John O'Brien and two of his aides on corruption charges. Tonight, we'll talk about the impact of that decision and what the long-term consequences might be, and will it have an effect on Beacon Hill lawmakers? And pleased to have joining me in this first half. She has been working for a few years on Beacon Hill as the representative, the executive director of Common Cause, the good government, public advocate of campaign and political reform, and she's joining us tonight to talk about last week's decisions and what happened. Pam, nice to have you here as always.
Thank you. Good to see you, Joe.
Thanks for coming back. Well, isolated incident or an indication of something inherently wrong with the system here in Massachusetts?
Well, I think in some ways it's both. It certainly was an isolated incident in this extent and of the issues in the probation department. It rose to almost a criminal enterprise. We do not see that in other parts of state government. We don't see test scores altered and systematic rigging of the system. Does it happen sometimes that people get relatives placed in jobs? Yes, it does. And it happens in private industry as well. The issue is, how do we ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again? And I think there are questions about how extensive. Certainly this kind of activity doesn't happen across state government. And I think people think it does, but that's unfortunate because that is not in fact the case.
Well, when you heard some of the names and dozens of names of current and former lawmakers being dropped during the trial, mentioning people proposing candidates for these jobs, wouldn't it kind of set that in motion? It's hard to kind of stop that way of thinking, wouldn't it? I mean,
well, sure.
Plays right into Holly Carr's hands, doesn't
it? For sure, and some of that is deserved. But there also were allegations that were not proved, often repeated in the media, that actually people testified against in the trial. No evidence, for example, that the speaker used these jobs as leverage to win the speakership, yet that was sort of talked about in the coverage around the trial, but when you actually heard what the witnesses said, they never said that, including the one that was essentially charged with saying it, who said that the O'Brien preferred DeLeo's candidates and told underlings not to take calls from his rival, because he had the vote sound up. But that's a big stretch between that and saying that He was
Well,
using jobs for votes.
Yet, the Carmen Ortiz, the U.S. attorney, her office said that Speaker DeLeo, for instance, was I think he was referred to as an unindicted co-conspirator. Those are pretty strong words.
Those are pretty strong words, and that is somewhat unique. The idea that what they actually convicted them of was was using gratuities, which essentially is trying to curry favor with lawmakers. How far that two-way street went, clearly their budget was left untouched, so there was some activity there. How far that went, I think the law enforcement could not get a quid pro quo, or they would have charged. It wouldn't have been an unindicted co-conspirator, it would have been an indicted co-conspirator. Nothing would have been bigger in her cap than to take down another speaker.
Well, and that raises an interesting point. Did Carmen Ortiz, fall short in this? I mean, much was made of this decision, but did she fall far short of where you think she wanted to go? There was no conviction, for instance, on bribery charges, which were included amongst the...
Yeah, I don't think the bribery charges were approved. So clearly they got 3 convictions on various different charges. That is a lot. A lot of the media around it was talking about acquittal across the board. That was certainly the scuttlebutt, given the judge's constant reminders that patronage is not against the law. Well, certain kinds of patronage actually are against the law. You're not allowed to try to pressure somebody into hiring someone who isn't qualified. Sending a letter on someone's behalf, that is perfectly within the law. Proposing candidates, that is also perfectly within the law. Making a quid pro quo arrangement, that is not. So some of these lines are difficult. They're difficult to prove. They're difficult to talk about. And one of the things that we're going to be doing over the next 6 months is talking to a wide variety of folks to see, have we gone far enough? I have to say that this kind of pressure, whether it's in government or elsewhere, is in private industry, is always around. There's always going to be pressure.
Certainly there
to
is.
put people.
Deval Patrick's hires, those weren't all based strictly on merit either, were
That's
they?
right.
I don't think anybody would even suggest that.
And one of the reasons that the probation department was so far south was because it was removed from the oversight of the judiciary in 2001 by Speaker Finneran. At the time, there was a big, brouhaha over the budget, and it was late, but that was Governor Jane Swift. She could have vetoed that provision. The Republicans could have objected. They did not. And so one of the claims is, what's wrong with Beacon Hills? We just need a 2-party system. Well, both parties sort of colluded in the setup to this scandal.
So no one has clean hands.
No one really does have clean hands. I think, and then the legislature has done a number of things to try to help stop the practice. I don't know whether they've gone far enough. The Ethics Commission has issued an advisory that gives guidance to lawmakers. It's pretty unworkable. It's not something that really they can follow very easily, and some of it is too tough and some of it isn't tough enough. So we're going to be also looking very closely at that and strongly recommending changes to it as well.
I want to ask you a little bit more about where you go with some of this, your organization, because you've been advocating for reforms for a long time. But if you listen to some lawmakers, they essentially suggesting that this whole process, the whole trial, the whole issue has kind of handcuffed them, that they're now afraid to help anybody for fear that somebody's going to point a finger at them and saying, you're trying to curry favor, you're trying to put your candidate in. Well, what do you tell lawmakers? Are they do you see it up there? Do you see, they seem a little more nervous?
Well, I'm sure that vis-a-vis the probation department, that is got the spotlight on it, and we're not going to be sitting many there.
Be double checking the scores
exactly.
now.
But I think constituent services continue on. There's a lot of variation between lawmakers in terms of what kind of districts they have and what they're called on to do. In suburban districts, there really isn't the same kind of need for help around, getting into drug treatment beds, getting into hospitals, negotiating social services, all sorts of things that.
Less an issue.
Yeah, it's less an issue. You have a more educated population that's able to use those services. That is tough. I mean, our social services have been decimated. It is very difficult to negotiate these systems. I worked as a social worker for a while, and case management has basically been eliminated from all but a.
So sometimes you need an advocate.
Right.
A couple of things. Now, could we see, you mentioned Carmen Ortiz and how much evidence did they have, but could we see some further prosecutions here as a result of this?
My guess is not. My guess is, anything is possible, but my guess is if they had the evidence, they would have done it all at once, and to string it out would be very unusual. When Paul Ware was appointed by the SJC,
right, to investigate
he was the judge who looked into the whole situation and produced a report, which was very detailed on this whole thing, and that was his work was partially used by the prosecution. They did further, investigation as well, of course. It was at that point, they had no evidence in the legislature. I think they may have found some more, but they didn't find enough. My guess is that that's it in terms of criminal prosecutions.
Unless John O'Brien comes up with some evidence, I guess. His sentencing is coming up, and he wouldn't be the first person convicted that flipped, so to speak, and brought forth evidence in an effort to kind of ameliorate his sentence or the punishment.
True. It is, as I said, is certainly possible. My guess is not. That will not be happening, and I could be wrong.
Indeed, I should mention his attorneys have said they plan to appeal. So
right, they will be appealing, but again, it is certainly plausible that even though there were these sponsorships and people asking for jobs then, and also being pleased when they actually succeeded, that the knowledge and expectation and understanding of how far all of this manipulation went was not present in the legislature.
Of course, Senate President Theresa Murray, who was mentioned frequently throughout, as were several other lawmakers, has announced she's not running for re-election. She'll be leaving office at the end of her term. Not so Speaker DeLeo. Could there be some long-term effects on him, on his credibility? He was very vociferous in his defense of his actions following the verdict. He made his public statement and denied any quid pro quo or any suggestion or any hint of wrongdoing.
Well, again, I think we have to be careful. Quid pro quo was not, on his part, was never charged. Right. It was never even, corroborated in any way.
There was no evidence.
So, it's not surprising that he would very strongly and vociferously argue against that. When the Ware report came out, the reaction of the Speaker and others in the legislature was a fair amount of shock and disbelief and upset. Now, part of it you may say, oh, well, that's kind of self-serving. Yeah. And perhaps it was, I don't know, but it seemed very genuine to me. That doesn't mean, though, that there wasn't issues in the way this case has been talked about. Because when people get jobs in government that aren't qualified for them, there's real harm done to the taxpayer and to the clients which that department serves. The probation department is a good example. For a while, it was known as a very innovative, top professional department, and it was essentially stripped down over a period of years and became a very ineffectual and very low morale. People that were doing a good job were passed over for promotions. So it turned into a terrible situation, and that has impact on what value we're getting as taxpayers, and then also what kind of services the people in the criminal justice system are getting. So there are real consequences to patronage, and we need to make sure that that doesn't happen other places.
And what kind of tone has it set in terms of you have your organization, you personally have been advocating for years for various reforms on Beacon Hill. Are they listening more closely after an incident like this? And
well, we've had a good year in the legislature this year. I don't think it's related to the trial. And as I said, there were some reforms that were put in place, including having public letters of recommendation. And some of the management. I think we need to go farther in the management of the courts. This has been an issue for many, many years. Many blue ribbon panels have talked about how the judiciary is sort of carved up into little pieces, and the legislature directs money to one little piece. And the judiciary needs the ability to actually manage themselves, to move resources around, to resist this kind of pressure. So back before all these reforms were put in, there was a story of how some names were floated, and there was an interview panel, and none of them got taken. And the people on the panel cursed out the speaker at that time and sent us better candidates, and we'll take some of them. You're exposing us. So, there needs to be both management systems in place and then ethics strictures that make sense, that can be followed and can be enforced. So there's criminal law and then there's civil law, and we may still see some civil stuff going forward.
Well, after, and we talked about this at the top of the show, but after having, 3 speakers in a row convicted and of different things, of course, but nonetheless, going back to Charlie Flaherty, and then, of course, Tom Finneran, and then Sel DeMacy, and now some hints or suggestions that something's askew here. Will the public believe it, no matter what? Will there has the credibility of all government, and especially lawmakers, been permanently harmed by this?
Well, it's just one more notch in the belt, but you have to remember that there is a concerted campaign to discredit government by a sector of the political spectrum that wants you to believe—
Works to their benefit.
Yeah, that no one there is worth anything, and they're all corrupt. Many people believe that, and it's unfortunate because it is not true. There are plenty of lawmakers who are doing great work for the right reasons and resist temptation. Now, there are others, and some of them that do sometimes fall down, just like individuals. And that's why we have law enforcement, that's why we have rules, that's why we have management structures in departments to hold them accountable. That's why we have you, the media, to be the eyes and ears, to shine a light on all this stuff.
Well, of course, one of the most corrosive factors, I think, on politics in general, of course, is we go back to money. And I know there's an issue percolate on Beacon Hill, and in fact, there may be a chance that it's passed yet. I know one house, I think, has one version, one has another. We're talking about the disclosure of these requirements for super PAC monies. We've got just a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah.
What's the chances of that, since, of course, the Citizens United ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, it's like all bets are off, and I think people are having a really hard time kind of, understanding, who to trust and what they should be looking for, and
well, all the money certainly makes everything much more complicated. It's a way of special interests influencing the legislative and other government processes. And can be effective. Lawmakers are people too, and when somebody pays millions of dollars on Congress and somewhat on the governor's race, it's going to be the same. So this bill that has actually passed the House and the Senate would require disclosure of these donors, which now are actually secret in some cases for a long time and some for a shorter period. But we need to have real-time disclosure so that we know who's paying for these ads. And in fact, the legislature has passed a provision that I've been pushing that actually lists the top donors in the TV ads themselves. So you can tell what the difference is, because all these names of these groups are just so vacuous, you don't know what they mean. It's the Committee for a Better Government, one Massachusetts, it doesn't mean anything. So to have the actual names there could mean a little bit more, and then there's more information on the website. So an important bill. I think it's going to get over the finish line, certainly pushing to make it. So we also have
4 days left in this
4 days left.
Legislative session, and of course the race is on. Is there other items up there that your organization feels that would contribute, though, to more faith in government?
Well, the legislature did pass another great provision that we've been working on for many, many years, and that's an election package to make it easier to vote. Now, it's pretty easy for some people and pretty hard for others. So we're one of the few states that doesn't have early voting, for example. That would start that. It would allow you to register online instead of having to go down to city or town hall, and to have 16-year-olds, when they get their driver's license, be able to sign up, which actually streamlines the process a lot. A whole bunch of other things to sort of encourage voter participation, because that's the other side of the coin. When you have low participation, special interests have even more sway. So we got to get out there and make our voices heard.
So no matter what happens, don't be discouraged.
That's right. That's right. It's true. Really don't. I've seen it over and over again, how people do make a difference.
Well, again, Pam Wilmot is the Executive Director of Common Cause Massachusetts. They have been advocating for political reform, campaign finance reform, and tonight talking about some of the fallout from last week's decision in U.S. District Court, the conviction of John O'Brien and 2 aides, and what impact that may have long-term on government, governance, and especially the legislature here in Massachusetts. Karen, as always, I enjoyed having you here.
Nice to have you too, Joe.
Thanks so much for joining us.